Okay, here we go. On the Road to Revolution, part. Okay, you've seen, you did your activity on the Boston, and basically this is going to lead to even more animosity. So as you saw, the tax on tea was the most hated. No representation on that. It's only 3 pence, but even though it was cheaper, we were not being represented. So we weren't letting them unload. The British sent of soldiers and a crowd gathers. Okay, you saw that video about the Boston Massacre, and some of you said it was, and some of you said it wasn't. But the fact is that 5 are killed, including Crispus Attucks, a freed African American. The trial is held, and the British they're going to put 8 British soldiers on trial, and they're defended by future President John Adams. He actually gets them off. Only 2 are found guilty of manslaughter, and their punishment is their hands were branded. This leads us up to the Gatsby incident of 1772. At Narragansett Bay in Providence, Rhode Island, and the Gatsby is a British ship, His Majesty's ship, and it was sent to catch smugglers. Well, Rhode Island was known for constant violating the Navigation Acts, and so here comes the Gatsby, and it's they actually removed a warning barrier, and it hits the rocks. And when it hits the rocks, the citizens shoot and wound the captain, they capture the crew, and they burn the ship. George III is furious, and he authorizes a commission of inquiry, and this is basically they say they can try any colonials directly in England instead of trying them here in the colonies, and the colonials saw this as a basic threat to them. King George was advised by Lord North, and George was a good guy. I mean, you know, he loved his wife, had 15 children, but he was not an effective ruler, and he got some very bad advice, and you can see here Lord North kind of looks like a yes man. So they do repeal the Townshend Acts. He does basically under pressure from British manufacturers, but he's going to keep that 3 pence tax on tea and assert Parliament's. In response, Samuel Adams, father of the Revolution and cousin to John Adams, he is going to organize the Committees of Correspondence. And the Committees of Correspondence' main objective was to exchange letters and to keep alive the opposition to the British. So basically it's kind of a Pony Express type thing. They're writing these letters and they're sending them from Boston to all the other colonies. The purpose? Let's warn those neighboring colonies about what's going on with the British, all their intolerable acts, and to broaden the resistance. So then the Tea Act is passed in 1773. Now the British East India Company had a monopoly on tea, and a lot of the Parliament members actually owned shares in the British East India Company, so they had a stake in this. And this permitted the company to sell tea directly to the colonies. It was cheaper, and he thought that the colonies would accept this, but he was sadly mistaken. Love that picture there. Okay, so the reaction was, even though it was cheaper, they were still angry, and they saw it as another way that England was asserting their dominance. This is going to result in the famous Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773, where the colonials will dress up like Indians and toss that tea into Boston.
The growing resentment of the colonists against British control culminated in a dramatic display of rebellion in Boston Harbor called the Boston Tea Party. It all started in 1773, when Britain wanted to save one of its prominent companies, the East India Tea Company, from bankruptcy. It allowed that company to sell surplus tea directly to colonists, bypassing colonial merchants along the way. The colonists were furious. As they saw it, Britain was trying to give a British company a monopoly on American soil. And by bypassing the American tea merchants who traditionally collected taxes, it was cheating the Americans out of money. The colonists decided to boycott East India tea, but for some colonists, a boycott didn't go far enough. Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, a vigilante group intent on protecting colonial rights, saw the tax on tea as an opportunity to rally support against British rule. Adams had organized groups of colonial patriots throughout the colonies to exchange information and monitor British activities. They were called the Committees of Correspondence and would be crucial in setting up the Boston Tea Party.
Sam proceeded to set up these committees of correspondence, and they started writing back and forth in the different colonies, saying we must stop this. He worked everybody up into quite a state of anger. And when the tea finally arrived, the taxed tea from the East India Company, Sam was ready.
In Boston, the unpopular governor, Thomas Hutchinson, an American appointed by the Crown, ordered the ships to remain in the harbor until the tea was unloaded. On December 16, 1773, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty organized about 100 Bostonians, disguised themselves as Indians, and boarded the ships.
They chopped open the tea and threw it all into Boston Harbor, destroying quite a lot of money.
Onlookers cheered as Boston Harbor became an enormous teapot. Governor Hutchinson fled the city, never to return. Not a single ounce of the several thousand chests of tea shipped by the East India Company ever reached colonial stores.
There were tea parties in other colonies, but nothing quite as dramatic and as expensive as the Boston Tea Party.
In Philadelphia and New York, mass demonstrations forced tea-bearing ships to return to England with their cargo holds still full. In Annapolis, protesters burned both the tea and the ships, chanting liberty and independence, or death in pursuit of it. Outside of Massachusetts, radical colonists burned tea leaves in solidarity with Boston. Others shook their heads at the destruction of private property and the breakdown of law. The British Parliament was outraged by this blatant act of rebellion and proceeded to slap the colonists with a new set of laws called the Intolerable Acts. They were designed to bring the colonists to their knees, but instead spurred them closer to the battle for independence.
So it took about 3 hours, and they dumped over 340 crates of tea, 90,000 pounds, today's value about $1 million. In response, the English are going to pass the Coercive or Intolerable Acts. You've read some of the details about that. They're going to close the Boston Harbor until the company gets their money back for the tea. A government act that will make all officials royally appointed instead of native colonials. A new Quartering Act. And then Administration of Justice Act, which is, again, a trial can be held in a different colony, or even a defendant could be moved to England and instead of being tried in their own locality. They're also going to pass something called the Quebec Act. There's still a whole lot of Frenchmen, about 60,000 French, who lived in Canada after the French and Indian War, and basically they're going to guarantee that they can keep their Catholic religion, traditions, and customs. And they extend an area into the Ohio River Valley, and this is what really upsets the colonials, because this is kind of, again, like the proclamation line, and they thought that this could infringe upon their basic rights. They're going to form the First Continental Congress. And the First Continental Congress, this is famously Patrick Henry, no taxation without representation. You're going to have 55 delegates from 12 colonies. The people in Georgia were busy fighting Indians, so they didn't show up. And basically it was, how do we respond to the coercive acts in the Quebec Act? And they're going to meet for about a month in Philadelphia, and they're going to decide. So they're going to completely boycott British goods. If you remember before, this worked out pretty well for the colonials. But then the British troops are going to be ordered to put down any possible rebellion. And they had word that Sam Adams and John Hancock, the famous smuggler, were actually in Concord, and that there were stores of gunpowder and guns there. And so this contingent of British forces is going to march towards Concord. And this is going to be the shot heard round the world, warned by Paul Revere and William Dawes. We're going to look at that famous poem by Longfellow about Paul Revere's ride. The British are coming. He actually said the regulars are coming, but you have two riders, and they are going to every Middlesex village and town, and we'll talk about that a little bit next time. The shots are fired, and the result is going to be devastating for the people at Lexington, but ultimately devastating for the British. We're going to go into detail on that, fear not. Okay, so the Second Continental Congress is going to be formed, and after the Battle of Lexington Concord, they reach out to the king and send him this olive branch petition. Even though the war looks like it started, the olive branch petition is basically kind of saying, hey, you know, we'll still be under England, we'll still pledge our allegiance with you, but you know, you've got to listen to us. And it's kind of, you know, just a basic reaching out and trying to avoid war. When we're looking at this, okay, there are, why are we trying to avoid war? The British had some very definite things going for them. They had population, about 5 million more British than colonists. They had more money, they had a better navy. We had virtually hardly any navy. They had about 50,000 regular soldiers, 30,000 that they hired, Hessians from Germany, and they also had some loyalists here. We'll talk about those. Those were known as the Tories, that didn't want to have anything to do with it. But they also had weaknesses. They were fighting in Ireland, and Britain, France was not real happy with them in the 7 Years' War, so France loomed as an ally to the colonies. And they didn't have the leadership they had under William Pitt, if you remember, with Wolfe and the Battle of Quebec. The English Whigs we talked about actually were anti-monarchy and encouraged the Americans to revolt. Their generals, not that great. Remember, we talked about that. The provisions provided to the soldiers were kind of icky too. They said they were wormy. They're far away, so distance made it difficult to keep them supplied. And the colonies are pretty big. There's not like they can attack one city or take one city and win this war. We have a lot of territory. So those were some of their weaknesses. The American advantages, we had George Washington, Ben Franklin, and a guy named Lafayette is going to come over from France to join us in the fighting. We're fighting a defensive war, so that's always an asset. We had agriculture to keep our army well fed. Valley Forge was a little bit different, but we'll get to that. And cause, if you ever read any Sun Tzu and the Art of War, he says if you've got the just and moral cause, that always gives you an advantage in war. So we'll especially talk about this when we get to the fighting in the South. We have a turning point at Saratoga, way up north, and then we have some battles in the South Carolina area, and even into Virginia, of course, and that's gonna be to our. So negatives, we are going to be fighting for a long time. We have suspicion about each other's and their power. We've got really no printed money, so we're going to have financial difficulties, supplies. We aren't going to be really in regular uniforms except our officers, and just kind of poorly equipped to fight. Most of our guys came with their own guns. So those are the American negatives. But you know the result, and we'll talk about more of that later. Was the American Revolution inevitable?